My father was a stranger to me for most of my life, and I told myself I was fine with that. I had built a whole story around it. The kind of story you tell at dinner parties when someone asks about your family and you want to sound unbothered. He left when I was 4. My mom raised me. I turned out okay. 3 sentences, delivered with a shrug, and people moved on. It worked for 26 years. Then he died, and a lawyer named Hutchins called me on a Tuesday morning while I was eating cereal over my kitchen sink. And everything I thought I'd made peace with came apart at the seams. "Mr. Calloway," the lawyer said, "your father, Edmund Calloway, passed away 9 days ago. You've been listed as the sole beneficiary of his estate." I put down my spoon. "His estate," I repeated. The word felt strange in my mouth, like it belonged to a different family. A property in coastal Maine. About 4 acres, including the house. There are some outstanding matters attached to it that we should discuss in person. I almost said, "No, I want to be honest about that." My first instinct was to tell this man I didn't need anything from Edmund Calloway, that I'd been managing without him since before I started kindergarten, and that whatever he'd left behind in coastal Maine could stay there and rot. But something stopped me. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the way the lawyer said outstanding matters. Careful and neutral, the way lawyers talk when they're trying not to alarm you before they have you sitting down. I drove up 3 weeks later. The town of Harwick sits on a strip of rocky coastline about 2 hours north of Portland. I'd looked it up on my phone before I left. Population under 2,000, 1 diner, 1 gas station, a boat launch that mostly served lobstermen. The kind of place that doesn't appear in travel magazines, but shows up in certain kinds of old New England paintings, all gray water and weathered wood and light that hits sideways in the late afternoon. My father's property was on the edge of town, down a gravel road that my GPS stopped caring about half a mile before I reached the house. I drove slowly, the spruce trees pressing in close on both sides, and then the road curved and the house appeared. I sat in my car for a long moment with the engine running. It wasn't large. 2 stories, cedar shingles gone silver with age, a front porch with a railing that had started to lean. A barn-style garage stood separate from the house, its doors padlocked with a heavy chain. Blackberry canes had climbed most of one side of it. The lawn, if you could call it that, was mostly wild grass and goldenrod, knee-high and heavy with seed. Every window had its blinds pulled down. It looked like a place where someone had chosen very deliberately to disappear. I told myself that was just the grief talking. But I didn't feel grief exactly. I felt something more like vertigo, the unsettling sensation of standing at the edge of a story that had been going on without me for decades, and suddenly being handed the last chapter. Mr. Hutchins met me in town that first afternoon and handed over the keys across a scratched conference table in a room that smelled like old carpet. He was in his early 60s, patient-eyed, with a way of pausing before he answered questions that made me think he'd had a lot of difficult conversations in that room. "Your father was very clear in his instructions," he said. "The property transfers to you entirely. There are back taxes owed, about $11,000, and a small outstanding balance on a utility account. Beyond that, the house is yours free and clear. $11,000. I'd been saving for a new transmission for 8 months. What are my options if I want to sell? That's where it gets complicated." He set a manila folder on the table between us. "There's a development company, Tidewater Group, that's been trying to acquire several properties in that stretch of coastline for about 6 years. Your father's land is the last private parcel they don't control. They've made offers before. They'll likely approach you. How much are we talking?" He named a figure. I kept my face neutral, but my hands went still in my lap. It was more money than I'd ever thought about in terms of my own life, the kind of number that rearranges what you think is possible. "Your father refused every offer," Mr. Hutchins said, watching me carefully. "For 6 years, he refused." I looked down at the folder. Did he say why? The lawyer was quiet for a moment. He said the land wasn't his to sell. I drove back to the house that evening and let myself in through the front door. Inside, it was dim and close, The air carrying that particular smell of a place that's been shut up for too long. Not quite mustiness, something more personal than that. Old coffee, cedar from a closet left open, a faint trace of pipe tobacco that I hadn't expected to hit me the way it did. I stood in the front hallway for a moment, with my hand on the door frame. I didn't know what I was looking for. Evidence of a person, maybe. Some arrangement of objects that would make a stranger into a father. The house was modest inside. Furniture from the late 90s, nothing remarkable. The shelves in the living room, holding paperback thrillers and fishing guides, and a few framed photographs I made myself look at slowly. My grandmother, young, standing in front of the same house. A man I didn't recognize in a hard hat, squinting into the sun, and one that stopped me cold. A photo of my mother, laughing, standing in what looked like the kitchen of this very house. She looked about 23. She looked happy. I hadn't known she'd ever been here. I spent the first 2 nights sleeping on a cot I'd brought from home and going through my father's papers. He'd been meticulous in a quiet way. Bills filed by year. A journal that turned out to be mostly weather observations and lobster counts. Property records going back to 1958 when his parents had bought the land. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that told me why a man would spend 6 years turning down a life-changing amount of money. On the 3rd morning, I found the floor. I'd been moving furniture to check for water damage. The realtor I'd called had suggested it, told me to look for soft spots, especially near the exterior walls. I was pushing an old chest of drawers away from the back wall of my father's study when one of the rear legs caught on a gap in the floorboards, and the whole thing tipped slightly, and I heard, beneath my feet, a sound like a hollow drum. I crouched down. The floorboards here were the same age-darkened pine as everywhere else in the house. But when I pressed on them, they moved differently, not the natural give of old wood, but a controlled flex, like something hinged. I ran my fingers along the seams and felt the hairline gap of a seam that didn't match the pattern of the rest of the floor. A rectangle, maybe 4 feet by 3, disguised in the tongue and groove, but deliberately cut. It took me 20 minutes to find the release. It was a recessed iron ring, flush with the wood, tucked under the edge of a baseboard that looked original but wasn't. When I pulled it, the panel came up smoothly, too smoothly for something that old, which meant someone had maintained it. Beneath it was a steel door, set into a concrete surround. It had a combination dial, the kind you'd see on a safe from the 1970s. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long time. My first thought, I'm embarrassed to admit, was practical. I'll need a locksmith. My second thought was stranger, something I couldn't quite articulate. A feeling that I was supposed to be here, that this was the specific thing the house had been waiting to show someone, that my father hadn't been hiding this. He'd been protecting it until the right person arrived. I called my college roommate, a guy named Wesley who I'd once watched pick a padlock with a bent paperclip out of pure boredom during finals week. He drove up that same afternoon. By the time he arrived, I'd already found the combination. It was my birthday. My actual birthday, month and day and year. My father had used my birthday as the combination to a hidden safe I hadn't known existed, in a house he'd never once invited me to visit. I turned the dial 3 times, feeling each number click into place, and pulled. The door opened with a sound like held breath being released. Below was a staircase, steep and narrow, lit by a string of LED work lights that hummed on automatically when the door opened, wired to the house's main panel, which meant my father had kept this accessible. It hadn't been sealed. He'd been going down here. Wesley stood behind me and said, very quietly, "Okay." We went down. The space below was larger than I'd expected. A single room, maybe 20 feet by 15, with a low ceiling and walls of poured concrete. It was dry, climate-controlled, I realized, because a small dehumidifier ran in the corner, and the temperature was noticeably steady compared to the damp chill of the house above. My father had been maintaining the environment. Whatever was down here, he'd been keeping it stable. There were filing cabinets, 4 of them, gray metal, military surplus looking. A folding table with a laptop that was several years old, a corkboard on one wall, completely covered, The kind of thing you see in crime thrillers and always looks dramatic, but this wasn't dramatic. It looked exhausted. It looked like work that had taken a very long time. The corkboard was a map, essentially, but not of geography. It was a map of transactions, photographs, contracts, deed transfers, coastal survey documents, newspaper clippings, red string connecting points like a web, names I didn't recognize. A corporate structure charted out in my father's handwriting on graph paper, tracking shell company after shell company until they all converged on a single name at the center of the web. Tidewater Group. Wesley stood at the board and read in silence for a while. Then he said, "Your dad was documenting something." "Yeah, for how long?" I looked at the dates on the clippings. The earliest was 11 years old. "A long time," I said. I spent the next 4 days in that room. What my father had assembled, piece by piece over more than a decade, was a paper trail that should have been buried. Tidewater Group's public face was straightforward. A coastal development firm, commercial real estate, the kind of company that builds upscale vacation rentals and charges seasonal rates that price out locals. But beneath that, in the filing cabinets and the carefully labeled folders, my father had documented something else entirely. Tidewater had been systematically acquiring properties along that stretch of Maine coastline, using a combination of methods that ranged from aggressive to fraudulent. Manufactured code violations reported to the county that pressured elderly owners into selling. A quiet arrangement with an assessor office that resulted in property tax hikes that weren't being applied evenly. And in at least 3 documented cases, something worse: liens placed on properties through a title company that Tidewater secretly owned, using paperwork that had been altered. 3 families had lost land that had been in their names for generations. One of them was an elderly man named Bernard who had signed documents he'd been told were refinancing paperwork. He'd lost 40 acres. He'd thought until he died that he'd made a mistake reading the fine print. My father had found this out because Bernard was his neighbor, his friend. He'd watched it happen, tried to help, and when the lawyers told him there was nothing to be done because the paperwork looked clean, he'd started digging. He'd never been able to prove the paperwork had been falsified. Not conclusively. He'd gotten close. There was a folder labeled Title Co. Discrepancies that contained a chain of document revisions, suggesting someone had gone back into electronic files and altered signing dates. But he'd needed one more piece. The original documents, the versions before the alterations, which he believed were held at a specific records storage facility that Tidewater used in Portland. He'd written a note to himself, paper-clipped to the inside of the folder. I read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. If I can't get there, whoever finds this will know where to look. The originals are at Coastal Document Storage, Unit 7F. The access code was changed after Bernard died. The new code is in the green ledger, under Hutchins' name. He'd known he might not finish it. He'd built the instructions into the archive itself, the way you'd leave directions for someone who was going to take over a job mid-project. He'd built it for me. He just hadn't known if I'd come. I found the green ledger at the back of the bottom filing cabinet. It was a standard accounting ledger, the kind with marbled covers, and under Mr. Hutchins' name there was a 6-digit number written in pencil. I sat at the folding table for a long time. Above me, through the ceiling, I could hear the house settling in the evening cold, the particular creaks of old wood contracting. The dehumidifier hummed. Outside the wind was picking up off the water. I could hear it faintly, even this far down. I thought about the offer from Tidewater. I thought about $11,000 in back taxes and a transmission I still hadn't fixed. I thought about my mother laughing in the kitchen photograph, young and happy, in a place I'd never known she'd been. I took a photo of the access code with my phone, closed the ledger, and went upstairs. Wesley was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked at my face and didn't ask any questions, just handed me a mug and sat down across from me. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "You could sell," he said, not pushing, just naming the option. Take the money, pay the taxes, walk away. Whatever your dad was doing, you didn't sign up for it. I know, but you're not going to do that. I looked at my coffee. Probably not. The next morning I drove to Portland. The records storage facility was a converted warehouse near the waterfront, climate-controlled, the kind of place that smells like archival boxes and industrial carpet cleaner. I gave the access code at the front desk, and a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain led me back to Unit 7F without any particular curiosity. People came and went from storage units with documents. It was an unremarkable thing. Inside the unit were 3 rows of shelving, all labeled. I found Tidewater's files in the second row. There were a lot of them, and I started looking for the title company records. It took me about 40 minutes. The original documents were there, and when I compared them to the copies my father had in his files, copies he'd obtained through a public records request years earlier, the discrepancy was clear enough that I understood why I'd been so careful. Whoever had altered the documents had done it well, but they hadn't done it perfectly. The signing dates on 3 specific transfers were slightly off from the notarization timestamps in a way that made no physical sense, and one document had a version tag embedded in its metadata that placed its last edit 8 months after the listed signing date. My father had been right. He just hadn't been able to get into this room. I photographed everything. I was there for 3 hours. The woman with the reading glasses brought me a paper cup of water at some point, and I thanked her and kept working. I drove back to Harwick in the dark. 2 days later, Tidewater called. Not through a lawyer. Through a man who said his name was Griffin, who had the smooth and practiced voice of someone who handled difficult conversations professionally, and who made it clear within the first 2 minutes that they were aware I'd inherited the property and were prepared to be generous. We've had a long relationship with that stretch of coastline, Griffin said. We'd like to continue working with the community there. Your father had some concerns about our company, and we take that seriously. We'd like the opportunity to clear the air. Clear the air, I said. There may have been some misunderstandings along the way. We'd like to address those, and we think the best path forward is one that works for everyone. He paused. We're prepared to increase our offer substantially. Take the back taxes off the table, clear the utility balance, and offer you a premium above market value. You could walk away from this whole situation without any complications. Without any complications. I wrote those words down on the notepad next to the phone. I'll think about it, I said. Of course. Take your time. Another pause, this one different, shorter, precise. I do want to mention that we're aware of some documents that may have come into your possession. We'd want those to be part of any agreement. There it was. I called Mr. Hutchins that same afternoon. He listened to everything I told him, about the room, the files, the storage unit, the phone call from Griffin, without speaking. When I finished, there was a long silence on his end. Your father came to me once, he said finally, about 4 years ago. He asked me whether I could refer him to someone at the State Attorney General's office. I gave him a name. I didn't ask what it was about. Did he ever follow up? Not with me. A pause. I always wondered why he'd stopped. I think my father ran out of time. I think he got sick. The death certificate had listed cardiac arrest, but the attending physician's notes that Mr. Hutchins had included in the estate file mentioned a longer history, and he'd made the decision to stop trying to carry it alone and to leave it for whoever came next, to build the archive and lock it and set the combination to the one number he was certain I'd know. I don't know if he thought I'd actually come. I don't know if he thought I'd look for it, but he'd set it up so that if I did, I'd have everything I needed. The contact at the Attorney General's office was a woman named Agent Fielding. She was actually at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and Mr. Hutchins' referral got me past a receptionist and into a 2-hour phone call that turned into an in-person meeting 3 days later in a conference room in Portland with 2 other agents and an assistant U.S. attorney. I brought hard copies of everything. I brought the photos from the storage unit. I walked them through the corkboard, which I'd photographed in sections, and the graph paper chart of corporate structure in my father's handwriting, and the folder labeled Title Co. Discrepancies. The assistant U.S. attorney asked careful, precise questions and took a lot of notes. One of the agents asked me twice whether I'd been contacted by anyone from Tidewater, and I told them about Griffin's call and the notepad without any complications written on it. And she asked if she could have the notepad. I left it with them. On the drive back to Harwick, I stopped at a gas station outside Brunswick and sat in my car in the parking lot for a while. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled like rain coming in off the water. I ate a granola bar I found in my jacket pocket and watched cars pull in and out. I thought about my father in that room. 11 years of work, alone, in a basement that nobody knew existed, building a case that he'd never been able to finish. I thought about Bernard, who'd signed papers he didn't understand, and Lostland his family had owned for 3 generations. I thought about the other 2 families. I thought about the way my mother's face had looked in that photograph, laughing in a kitchen in a house I'd never been allowed to know about. I called her that evening. I hadn't called her since I'd driven up here. I hadn't known what to say, and she picked up on the second ring and said my name in a voice that meant she'd been waiting. "You knew about the house," I said. A long pause. "Yes, did you know about the room?" An even longer pause. I knew he was working on something. He never told me what it was. After we separated, she stopped, started again. He was always working on something he couldn't talk about. I thought it was just who he was, someone who carried things alone. He left it for me. I know. Her voice was quiet. I think he always hoped you'd want to know him. He just didn't know how to ask. I stayed in Harwick for another 2 weeks while things moved. Agent Fielding called me periodically with questions. Mr. Hutchins handled the legal piece of declining Tidewater's offer, which generated a phone call from Griffin that was noticeably less smooth than the first one. I paid the back taxes with money I'd been saving for the transmission. I cleaned out the house slowly, room by room, and I let myself look at things. The fishing guides on the shelf, the photographs, the weather journal with its years of observations about tides and temperatures in a place my father had chosen to be. In the end, the investigation took months. I wasn't involved in most of it, but Agent Fielding called me the following spring to tell me that Tidewater Group's principals had been indicted on charges including wire fraud, falsification of documents, and conspiracy. The title company at the center of it had its license suspended. There were civil proceedings attached. The families who'd lost property were named in a restitution case. Bernard's family was one of them. I still own the house in Harwick. I go up a few times a year, mostly in the fall when the light comes in sideways off the water and the spruce trees go dark against the sky. I've fixed the porch railing. I've cleared most of the blackberry canes from the side of the garage. I've left the room exactly as it was. The corkboard, the filing cabinets, the folding table. I don't know if I'll ever do anything with it, or if it'll just become part of the house's history, another layer of the story I keep learning about the man who lived here. I think about him sometimes when I'm working out there. What it must have been like to decide, after years of trying, that the best you could do was build something and hope that someday someone would find it and know what to do. That kind of faith is hard for me to understand. I'm still not sure if I think it was brave or just profoundly lonely. Maybe it was both. Most of the things that matter are. If you found something like that, hidden by someone you barely knew, meant for you, asking you to finish something you never agreed to start, would you open it or would you walk away?